Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. It started when a family in California noticed a faint, unpleasant smell in their home. At first, it was barely noticeable, a subtle scent that seemed to come and go, almost like something dead was lingering somewhere in the house. They thought it was probably a rodent that had died somewhere in the walls. But when days turned into weeks, the smell became more persistent, and they couldn't ignore it any longer. The odor seemed to be strongest near the crawl space beneath their house, a dark, musty area they rarely paid attention to. The father of the family, concerned that the smell was growing worse, decided to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight, his curiosity piqued and his mind racing with thoughts of what it could be. The crawl space, which was small and cramped, wasn't a place anyone wanted to spend much time in. Still, he crawled into the dark, knowing he had to get to the bottom of it. As he moved deeper into the crawl space, the smell became unbearable, nearly choking him. He felt his way through the darkness, his flashlight flickering, casting eerie shadows on the dirt floor. It was then that he heard it, faint shuffling noises coming from the far corner. The sounds were unsettling, like something, or someone, was moving around. His heart skipped a beat. He paused, listening closely. The noise stopped, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Despite the growing sense of dread, he continued forward. He had to know what was causing the smell. As he turned the corner of the crawl space, he was met with a sight that froze him in his tracks, a pile of blankets. They were torn, stained, and looked like they had been used recently. A chill ran down his spine. He pulled the blankets back cautiously, expecting to find something that could explain the smell. Instead, he found an assortment of disturbing items scattered across the floor: old, yellowed photographs, scraps of clothing, and odd pieces of paper with strange markings. The photos were the most unsettling of all. Faces of people he didn't recognize stared back at him, their expressions cold and haunting. They seemed out of place, as though they had been placed there with a purpose. The father's hand trembled as he sifted through the photographs, wondering who these people were. But what he found next made his stomach churn. Small, animal bones were carefully arranged on the ground. They were not from any of the family's pets, and the sight of them made his blood run cold. Panic set in as the reality of what he was seeing began to sink in. Someone had been living here, beneath his family's house. It wasn't just a squatter hiding for a few days. This was someone who had been living in the crawl space for who knew how long. The thought that this person had been so close to his family, without them ever knowing, was terrifying. He quickly backed away, feeling an overwhelming sense of fear and violation. The family immediately called the police, who arrived and searched the area. They found no sign of forced entry, and the crawl space entrance remained intact, as if it had been undisturbed. By the time the authorities arrived, the intruder was gone. There was no trace of the person who had been living there, and no one could explain how they had entered the crawl space in the first place. The family was left with more questions than answers. Who was this person? How had they managed to live there for so long without being noticed? The items found in the crawl space, those photographs, the bones, seemed to tell a story, but one they would never fully understand. As the days went on, the father couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching them from just beneath their feet, observing their every move. The incident left the family unsettled. Every creak in the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside, now felt like a reminder of what had happened. They had once thought of their home as a sanctuary, but now, it felt like anything but. The horror of discovering someone had been living under their house, so close to their family, would stay with them forever. The crawl space was no longer just a forgotten area of the house. It had become a dark and terrifying reminder of the nightmare that had unfolded beneath their feet. It began with a faint, almost imperceptible odor, a smell so subtle that at first, the family thought they were imagining it. It wasn't something that would immediately cause concern. It was more of a mild, musty scent, like something that had been sitting and used for a while. Over time, the smell began to linger in the background, occasionally getting stronger and then fading, like a bad memory that wouldn't quite leave. They first noticed it in the basement, but as the days went on, it seemed to travel, appearing in different parts of the house at the most inconvenient times. The father, who had always been the one to tackle household problems, figured it was just something typical in a home of their age. Perhaps it was the old plumbing, or maybe the venting system needed maintenance. He decided to wait a few days before doing anything about it. After all, the smell wasn't unbearable. But as time passed, it began to cling to everything, the curtains, the furniture, even the walls. It didn't take long for the family to agree that this wasn't a simple household issue. It wasn't until one late afternoon when the smell intensified that the father started to worry. He had been cleaning the attic, dusting off old boxes that hadn't been touched in years, when the odor seemed to fill the entire space. The attic was old, with wooden beams that creaked and groaned when stepped on. He quickly checked around, but there was no sign of mold or any source of the smell. Yet it remained, pungent and sickly, hanging in the air like a cloud. He decided to check under the house. The crawl space was something they rarely thought about, a small and cramped area that wasn't easy to access. It was the kind of space where things went to be forgotten. The father pulled out a flashlight, his mind already jumping to conclusions about the source of the smell. Maybe a rodent had died beneath the floorboards, or perhaps there was something decaying under there. Crawling into the narrow, dark space was no easy task. The father had to wedge himself between the beams and crawl on his stomach, the air thick with dust. The flashlight flickered as he navigated deeper into the crawl space, and the stench became overpowering. It wasn't just musty anymore, it had a distinct, decayed quality to it, as though something organic was rotting out of sight. As he crawled further, the smell seemed to grow stronger, almost suffocating. He was starting to regret this decision, but he pressed on, hoping to find the source of the problem so he could solve it. Suddenly, he heard something, a faint, scratching noise coming from further ahead. It was subtle, almost like the sound of nails scraping against wood. He froze, unsure if he had imagined it or if it was real. The father's heart began to race. He strained his ears, listening intently, but the sound had stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the occasional creak of the old house above him. He shook off the unease and moved deeper into the crawl space. But the noise lingered in his mind, a nagging thought he couldn't shake. What was it? And was he alone in there? He pushed forward, determined to find the source of the smell. But then, something caught his eye, a shadow in the corner of the crawl space, just beyond the reach of his flashlight. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a chill through him. He moved closer, his flashlight beam dancing over the cluttered ground. He thought it was a pile of old insulation at first, but then he realized it was something else entirely. It was a blanket. A ragged, torn blanket, half buried under debris. The father's pulse quickened. Who would leave something like that here? It didn't belong. It didn't feel like something that was simply forgotten. He pulled back the blanket cautiously, dreading what he might find beneath it. Underneath, he discovered more than he bargained for. The area wasn't just messy, it was filled with items that had no business being there. Old, yellowed photographs, bits of torn clothing, and even pieces of paper with strange, cryptic symbols. The photographs were unsettling. Faces of people he didn't recognize stared back at him, their eyes empty and lifeless. There was something about the way they were arranged that made his skin crawl. They weren't just forgotten keepsakes, they seemed to tell a story, but it wasn't one he wanted to understand. The father moved cautiously through the pile of debris, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. But the more he uncovered, the more disturbed he became. Small, animal bones were scattered among the items, arranged in a way that looked deliberate. The bones weren't from any of the family's pets. This was something else, something darker. He recoiled, his mind racing with the implications. Who had left these things behind? And more importantly, who had been living here? The thought made his blood run cold. He was certain now that someone had been hiding in the crawl space, living just beneath his family's feet for who knew how long. Panic set in as he realized the gravity of the situation. He quickly backed away from the pile of items, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get out. He crawled frantically toward the entrance of the crawl space, his breath quickening with every move. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but it wasn't this. The feeling of being watched weighed heavily on him, like someone, or something, was following his every movement. Once he was back inside the house, he couldn't shake the images from his mind. The photos, the bones, the feeling of being so close to someone, or something, who had been living just below his family's home. He immediately called the police, but he knew deep down that they wouldn't have any answers. Who would? The idea of someone hiding there, so close and undetected, was terrifying. The police arrived, but by the time they investigated the crawl space, the intruder was long gone. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints leading to or from the house. The only thing left behind was the disturbing collection of items in the crawl space, a haunting reminder that someone had been there, watching and waiting in the shadows. Despite a thorough search of the area, the police never found the person who had been living there. The family was left with more questions than answers. Who was this person? How had they managed to stay hidden for so long? The terror of not knowing lingered in the air, like a storm cloud that refused to dissipate. The father would lie awake at night, the events of that day playing over and over in his mind. Had the intruder been watching them? Had they known the family's every move? The uncertainty gnawed at him, making it impossible to feel truly safe in his own home again. Even years later, the memory of that crawl space would haunt him. He would often wonder if the person who had lived there was still out there, waiting, watching, and if they ever planned to return. The feeling of being so close to something unknown, something dangerous, was a terror that never fully left him. As the days turned into weeks, the smell only seemed to grow stronger. What had once been a faint, musty scent soon became overpowering, almost suffocating. It was no longer just an unpleasant odor that lingered in the corners of the house. It felt like the entire home had absorbed it, as if the walls themselves had taken on the stench. The family's attempts to air out the house, open windows, and light candles had no effect. The smell refused to fade. The father, growing increasingly frustrated, decided to investigate the crawl space again. But this time, he didn't want to just check for dead animals or mold. He wanted to find out why the smell had become so persistent, almost as if it was spreading from some hidden source. He had checked the attic and the basement, but now he was convinced the crawl space was the source. Every time he passed by the area where the crawl space entrance was located, a sense of unease settled over him. The thought of crawling into that dark, confined space filled him with dread. Yet, he had to do it. He couldn't let this go on any longer. With a deep breath, he grabbed his flashlight and made his way to the crawl space. The moment he opened the trapdoor, the smell hit him like a wave. It was so overpowering that he almost gagged, but he fought through it. The house, despite being relatively new, had settled over time, and the crawl space was damp and full of cobwebs. It wasn't a place anyone willingly spent time in. But now, it felt like the only place where the mystery could be solved. As he crawled deeper, his flashlight beam trembled in his hand. The shadows of the beams above him stretched out like fingers, grabbing at the edges of his vision. The air grew colder as he moved further into the crawl space, and the smell seemed to follow him, making it harder to breathe with each passing second. The farther he went, the more the atmosphere seemed to change. The ground beneath him, once solid dirt, became uneven, and there were strange objects scattered across the floor. He couldn't tell what they were in the dim light of his flashlight, but something didn't feel right. It was like the crawl space was more than just a storage area. It was as if it was hiding something. His pulse quickened as he moved closer to a pile of debris in the far corner of the crawl space. The smell was unbearable now, clinging to everything. He shone his flashlight toward the pile, and that's when he noticed it, a blanket, covered in dirt and torn to shreds. His first instinct was to pull away and leave, but his curiosity got the better of him. He pushed the blanket aside. Beneath it was a collection of strange items, old photographs, bits of clothing, and torn scraps of paper. The photographs caught his attention first. The faces in them were blurred, distorted, as though they had been deliberately damaged. The more he looked, the more unnerving they became. They weren't just ordinary family photos, they were pictures of people he didn't recognize, with vacant eyes and grim expressions. The sense of unease grew as he flipped through them, each image more unsettling than the last. He moved on, pushing through the pile of debris, his flashlight beam sweeping over more unsettling objects. There were small, animal bones scattered across the floor, arranged in a strange pattern. They didn't belong to any of his pets, nor did they look like something that would be naturally found in a house. The father recoiled, his stomach turning at the sight. This was no ordinary mess. It was the work of someone, or something, far more sinister. With every item he uncovered, the father's heart rate increased. He couldn't help but wonder who had been living here. Had someone been hiding in the crawl space, using it as a place of refuge? And if so, for how long? The thought of someone secretly occupying that dark, hidden space while his family lived obliviously above was too terrifying to fully comprehend. As he continued to explore, he found more clues that didn't make sense. Small, personal items, like a worn-out wallet, a book with the pages torn out, seemed out of place in a crawl space. These weren't things that would have been left behind by a typical squatter. It felt like someone had been living there for far longer than he had imagined. His mind raced with questions. Who was this person? How had they managed to stay hidden for so long? And why hadn't anyone noticed? He thought back to the odd noises he had heard in the crawl space at night. The faint shuffling sounds that had seemed to echo through the house. Had that been the intruder moving around? Had they been watching his family all along? Fear began to set in, and he knew he had to get out of there. Every instinct told him to retreat, to leave the crawl space and never return. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The air around him felt thick, heavy, as if something was lurking just beyond the beam of his flashlight. With his heart pounding in his chest, he began to back away slowly, careful not to disturb anything further. But as he crawled toward the entrance, he couldn't help but glance over his shoulder. The pile of debris, the photos, the bones, everything seemed to stare back at him, silently accusing him of uncovering something that should have stayed hidden. When he finally emerged from the crawl space, he couldn't escape the feeling that something had followed him. The house felt different now, darker, colder. Even the familiar sights of the living room and kitchen seemed unsettling. He had to act fast. There was no time to waste. He immediately called the police. The authorities arrived quickly, but by the time they arrived, the intruder was long gone. They searched the crawl space thoroughly, but there were no signs of forced entry. No footprints. No evidence of how the person had gotten in. It was as though the intruder had vanished without a trace. The only evidence left behind was the disturbing collection of photographs, bones, and other items. Despite a thorough investigation, the police could never determine who had been living in the crawl space. No one knew how the person had gotten in or how long they had been hiding there. The family was left with more questions than answers, and the feeling of fear and uncertainty lingered long after the investigation had ended. The father lay awake at night, replaying the events over and over in his mind. He wondered if the person who had been hiding in the crawl space was still out there. Had they been watching his family? Had they known everything about their lives? The thought haunted him, and no matter how many times he checked the crawl space, the fear remained. the family never truly felt safe again. Every creak in the floorboards, every whisper of wind in the walls, reminded them of the presence that had been lurking just beneath their feet. They never found out who had been there, but the terror of knowing that someone had been so close to them for so long was enough to change their lives forever. Panic set in as the father's mind raced. He had just uncovered something far worse than what he had expected. The discovery of the blanket, the photographs, and the bones was enough to send a chill down his spine, but it was the realization that someone had been living under their house that truly terrified him. How had he not noticed? Had he been unknowingly living alongside a stranger? The questions swirled in his head like a storm, each one more unsettling than the last. His heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled out of the crawl space. The suffocating air felt oppressive, and the smell seemed to cling to his clothes, his hair, and his skin. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as though the darkness of the crawl space had somehow followed him out. Every shadow now seemed to hold the potential for danger. The thought of being watched by someone who had been hiding in the house for an unknown period of time, left him shaken to the core. Once he made it back into the living room, he glanced nervously at the corners of the room, half expecting to see someone emerge from the shadows. The entire house seemed different now. It no longer felt like a home, it felt like a prison, a place that was no longer safe. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, now felt like a threat. His senses were on high alert, his mind constantly on edge. He quickly ran to the phone and dialed the police. The words tumbled out of his mouth in a rushed, frantic manner. He explained what he had found in the crawl space, the blanket, the photographs, the bones, and most importantly, the feeling that someone had been living there. The dispatcher on the other end reassured him that officers would be on their way immediately, but the father couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him. While waiting for the police to arrive, he couldn't sit still. He paced around the house, his eyes constantly scanning every corner, every shadow. He couldn't understand how someone had managed to live beneath their house without them ever noticing. The space was so cramped, so out of the way. How could they have hidden there for so long? The sound of sirens in the distance brought some relief, but it didn't quiet the panic gnawing at his insides. The police arrived quickly, and the father led them to the crawl space, his heart pounding in his chest with each step. He could hardly believe the words coming out of his mouth. How was it possible that something like this could happen under his very roof? The officers examined the crawl space carefully, inspecting the photographs and bones that had been left behind. They took notes, asking questions the father could hardly answer. How long had the person been living there? Did he recognize any of the faces in the photographs? Had there been any signs of forced entry? He didn't have answers for any of it, and that uncertainty only fueled the fear building inside him. The more the police investigated, the more bizarre the situation seemed. There were no signs of forced entry into the crawl space, no broken locks, no footprints leading up to the house. It was as if the intruder had simply appeared from nowhere. The crawl space had been untouched by time, undisturbed by the outside world, and yet someone had managed to make it their home, right under their noses. The father couldn't help but feel a sense of violation as the officers moved through the space. They were asking him questions, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the discovery over and over. Who could have done this? Who had been living in their crawl space? What had they been doing there all this time? And most frightening of all, had they been watching him and his family without their knowledge? The investigation continued for hours, but the police found no further clues. It was as though the person who had been living there had simply vanished without a trace. There was no evidence to suggest that anyone had been coming and going from the crawl space. The officers took the photographs and bones as evidence, but they didn't have much else to go on. The father was left with more questions than answers. The police, though diligent, were unable to uncover anything that could explain what had happened. No one could explain how the intruder had gotten in, or how long they had been living there. It was as if the entire thing had been some strange, twisted nightmare, and they had just woken up from it. In the days that followed, the family tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but the feeling of unease lingered. The father couldn't shake the thought that someone had been so close to them for so long. Had they been watching his children as they played in the yard? Had they been listening in on family conversations? The idea that someone had been living beneath their home, hidden in the shadows, was too much for him to bear. He spent hours combing through the house, checking every corner, every nook and cranny, convinced that there was something he had missed. But each time he found nothing, the unease only grew. He had checked the crawl space, but now he couldn't help but feel like the danger was still there, lurking just out of sight. The family's life had been irrevocably changed. The house, once a place of comfort and safety, now felt like a trap. Every noise, every movement, felt like it was connected to the intruder. The sense of fear became almost constant, like a weight pressing down on their chests. And no matter how many times the father checked the crawl space, the terror of not knowing who had been there remained. One night, while lying in bed, the father heard something. A faint scratching sound, like something dragging across the floor. His heart skipped a beat. He lay still, listening, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. Could it be the wind? Or was it something else? He couldn't be sure. But the thought that someone might still be in the house, hiding in the shadows, sent him into a panic. The family eventually moved out, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. The mystery of the intruder was never solved, and the house remained empty for years. Despite the passage of time, the memories of what happened in the crawl space continued to haunt them, a reminder that danger can lurk in the most unexpected places. The family never returned to that house, and the mystery of who had lived beneath their feet remained unsolved, a chilling and unanswered question that would forever linger in their minds. After the police left, the family tried to go back to their normal lives, but it wasn't easy. Every little sound seemed to trigger a wave of panic. The house, once filled with comfort and laughter, now felt like a place of danger. The father couldn't stop thinking about the crawl space, the things they had found there. The photos, the bones, and the disturbing thought that someone had been living beneath them, hidden in plain sight. They hadn't just been intruders, they had been a part of the house, as if the house itself had been keeping secrets from them. The mother, too, began to notice things she hadn't before. Little things, like shadows that seemed to move on their own or strange noises coming from the walls. The house creaked and groaned at odd hours, as if it had a life of its own. At night, she would hear faint footsteps, but when she looked around, there was nothing there. It wasn't enough to cause her to call the police again, but it was enough to make her uneasy. Every night became a restless one, and sleep seemed impossible. The children also began to act differently. They were no longer as carefree as before. They would refuse to play near the crawl space and seemed afraid of the dark. The father noticed their hesitation when they walked through the hallway that led to the door of the crawl space. They had never shown fear of the house before, but now, every creak in the floor seemed to terrify them. Even the family dog, once a loyal and brave protector, became skittish, growling at seemingly nothing in the corners of the house. The father tried to reassure his family that everything was fine, but deep down, he knew things would never be the same. The memories of what they had found in the crawl space haunted him. He had checked again the next morning to see if something had been missed, but everything was as it had been. The pile of old photographs and the animal bones were still there. The blanket was still tucked into the corner, as if it had never been disturbed. But the question that gnawed at him was simple: why? Why had this person been in their house? What was the point of it all? He thought about getting the house checked for hidden cameras, for any other clues that might explain what had happened. But that idea felt absurd. Who would have the time and patience to set up a hidden network of surveillance in a family's home? But then again, someone had lived in their crawl space for God knows how long, so perhaps anything was possible. Days turned into weeks, and the family tried their best to move on. But the house no longer felt like home. It was as if the very walls were watching them, whispering secrets they could not understand. The father would often find himself standing in the hallway, staring at the door to the crawl space, wondering if someone was still there. Was the house truly empty? Or was there something lurking beneath the floorboards, watching them? The atmosphere in the house grew colder over time, even though the seasons had not changed. The father found it difficult to shake the feeling that someone was there, just beyond his reach, watching his every move. It wasn't just the house that seemed different, it was his perception of everything around him. The comfort he once felt in his home had been replaced with a constant sense of dread. One night, while the family was gathered in the living room, they heard a loud thump coming from above them, followed by a series of dragging sounds. The father jumped up, his heart racing. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It was the same kind of noise they had heard before, the kind that made him so paranoid. This time, however, he wasn't willing to let it go. He grabbed his flashlight and headed for the attic. The attic door creaked as he opened it, and the father's pulse quickened. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing old boxes and forgotten furniture. The sound had come from up here, but there was no sign of anyone or anything unusual. It was as if the noise had just appeared from thin air. He checked every corner, but found nothing out of the ordinary. Disappointed and unsettled, he returned to the living room, but the feeling of being watched had not left him. It only grew stronger, like a weight pressing down on his chest. He sat down, trying to shake the unease that had settled over him, but his mind kept racing. He thought about the photographs again, the faces of people he had never met, the ones who had seemed so familiar yet so distant. It was as if they were trying to tell him something important. The next day, he decided to confront the neighbors, hoping to find some answers. Perhaps someone had seen something, or maybe there were rumors about the house. He didn't know what he expected, but anything was better than the nagging uncertainty that had taken root in his mind. The neighbors, however, were no help. They hadn't noticed anything unusual. They had lived next door for years and had never seen or heard anything out of the ordinary from the house. This only deepened his sense of isolation. No one had answers, and the police seemed to have moved on, leaving him to deal with the aftermath alone. But the father couldn't move on. He felt as though he was losing his grip on reality. The house seemed to have a life of its own, one that was out of his control. Every time he walked through the rooms, every time he passed by the crawlspace door, he felt as if something or someone was waiting for him. Weeks passed, and the noises continued. They started to change, becoming more frequent, more pronounced. The dragging sounds turned into knocking, then whispering, and sometimes even low, guttural growls. It was as if the very walls of the house were speaking to him, trying to get his attention. The children began to retreat further into their rooms, refusing to leave. Their fear had grown too strong to ignore. Then, one night, everything changed. The father was lying in bed, listening to the familiar creaks of the house settling, when he heard a loud, unmistakable sound. It was a thud, followed by a long scrape. The sound came from the crawlspace. He froze, unable to move, his heart pounding in his chest. He slowly got up and grabbed the flashlight, the same one he had used in the crawlspace weeks before. He made his way to the door, but just as his hand reached for the knob, he stopped. Something inside him screamed to turn around, to leave the house behind. But he couldn't. He opened the door, and as he did, the temperature in the hallway dropped sharply, his breath visible in the air. The flashlight flickered, then died. The house was silent again, as if it had never made a sound. The father knew then that whatever had been in the crawlspace was still there. And it wasn't just haunting the house, it was haunting him. Days passed, and the unsettling events in the house continued. Every corner seemed to hold secrets, and every shadow felt like it was watching. The father could no longer ignore the gnawing sense that something was wrong. He tried to focus on the everyday tasks, work, cleaning, caring for the family. But it was impossible to shake the feeling that something unseen was moving through their lives. His once peaceful home had turned into a place of constant unease. The children were the most affected. They had become withdrawn, their eyes constantly darting to the dark corners of the house. At night, they would cry out in their sleep, their dreams haunted by things the father couldn't understand. They refused to sleep alone, clinging to their mother's side whenever they could. The father had tried to reassure them, but his own fear had begun to mirror theirs. He had no answers for them. No comfort he could offer seemed to ease their growing terror. One evening, the father was walking through the hallway when he noticed something strange. The door to the crawl space was ajar, slightly open. He had always kept it closed after the police had inspected it, but now, it was wide open. His heart raced as he stepped closer, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence of the house. He glanced inside, but the darkness swallowed the view. The father hesitated, his breath catching in his throat. There was something deeply wrong about that space now, something he couldn't explain. He had to know what was inside. With a deep breath, he stepped into the crawl space. The air was thick, heavy, and the smell of mildew and decay filled his nostrils. He scanned the area, his eyes darting between the shadows, but everything appeared to be just as it had been before. The blanket, the bones, the photographs, they were all still there. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. The quiet seemed suffocating, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to leave. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A new photograph was pinned to the wall. It was one he hadn't seen before. His hands trembled as he reached out and took it down. The image was of his own family, taken from inside their house. The photo had been taken from a distance, showing them through the window, unaware. The father's stomach twisted as he realized that whoever had been hiding in their crawl space had been watching them for much longer than he had thought. A chill ran down his spine. The thought that someone had been watching them, hidden just beneath their feet, was too much to bear. He felt a sudden urge to get out of the crawl space, to escape the suffocating feeling that had overtaken him. But before he could move, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft but distinct, moving just above him. His breath caught in his throat, and he froze. There was no one in the house. He had checked every room. No one had entered or left. Yet the sound was undeniable. He quickly scrambled out of the crawl space, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of footsteps continued, but now it seemed to be coming from the floor above. The father looked up, his mind racing. Who was up there? Was someone in the attic? He didn't know what to think anymore. His mind was playing tricks on him, or so he tried to tell himself. But deep down, he knew this was something more than just his imagination. Frantically, he grabbed a ladder and climbed to the attic, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the room. The attic was just as he had left it, empty, cold, and still. There was nothing there. No sign of anyone, no signs of movement. The only thing that greeted him was the lingering smell of old wood and dust. He stood there for a moment, listening, but the only sound was the creak of the house settling. It was quiet, but it felt wrong, as if something was just out of reach, hiding in the silence. Doubt began to creep in. What if it wasn't someone else in the house? What if the noises were something more sinister? The father couldn't shake the idea that something had taken root in the house, something that had been there long before they moved in. He began to wonder if the house itself was somehow cursed, if the very foundation held the memories of those who had lived and died within its walls. The thought was unsettling, but the more he considered it, the more it seemed possible. Over the next few days, the house grew colder, and the strange occurrences continued. The father would often hear whispers in the walls, faint murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere. The family dog, once fearless, had started barking at seemingly empty corners, growling at nothing. The children grew more terrified with each passing day, and the father found himself growing more and more exhausted. His once rational mind was slipping into paranoia. He couldn't trust his senses anymore, couldn't be sure if what he was experiencing was real or just his mind playing tricks on him. One evening, he couldn't take it any longer. He called the police again, but this time, he didn't know what to tell them. He had no evidence to prove anything. How could he explain the whispers in the walls? The shadows that seemed to move on their own? The police had already searched the house thoroughly, and they had found nothing. But this time, he wasn't willing to let it go. He needed answers. When the officers arrived, they listened to his concerns, but their skepticism was evident. They didn't believe in the supernatural. They checked the crawl space again, looked through the attic once more, but found nothing. They reassured him that the house was safe, that there was no sign of any intruder. Yet, the father's anxiety didn't subside. The house still felt like a trap, and every night, he lay awake, listening to the sounds that seemed to come from the walls themselves. In the days that followed, the father grew desperate. He began researching the house's history, hoping to find any clue that would explain the bizarre happenings. What he discovered sent a shiver down his spine. The house had once belonged to an elderly woman who had lived alone for many years. Neighbors remembered her as reclusive and strange, but no one had known exactly what happened to her. Her death had been a mystery, her body had been found under suspicious circumstances, and rumors had circulated that her spirit had never left the house. The father's research made him wonder if the house was haunted. But no matter how many times he read about the previous owner, no clear answers emerged. The mystery remained, just like the growing sense of dread that gripped him and his family. It was as if the house itself was trying to tell them something that they couldn't understand. But one thing was certain, the strange occurrences were not going to stop. And no matter how hard the father tried to rationalize it, the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them from the dark corners of the house only grew stronger. After the unsettling discovery of the photograph in the crawl space, the father's mind became consumed with questions. Who had been watching them? Why was there no trace of the person who had lived in their house? He tried to convince himself that it was just some twisted prank or a figment of his imagination. But as days passed, the strange events continued to escalate, making it impossible for him to dismiss the idea that something sinister was happening. The family tried to maintain a semblance of normality, but the house had become a constant source of fear. Every sound, every creak, felt like a warning. The children no longer played outside or spent time in their rooms alone. The father found them huddled together in the living room at night, their faces pale with terror. They couldn't explain it, but they all sensed that something was not right. The house had become a living, breathing entity, one that they could neither escape nor understand. At night, when the house fell silent, the father would lie awake, staring into the darkness. He tried to rationalize the sounds he heard, the soft thuds from the attic, the scraping noises from the walls, but the more he thought about it, the more unsettling it became. It wasn't just the noise. It was the feeling that someone, or something, was still living in the house, hidden in the shadows. One night, after hearing the familiar scratching sound coming from the attic, the father decided he couldn't ignore it any longer. He grabbed a flashlight and made his way up to the attic, hoping to put an end to the mystery once and for all. The attic door creaked as he opened it, and he shivered as he stepped into the dark, musty space. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew filled his nose. He shone the flashlight around the room, but there was nothing. No signs of intruders. No hidden rooms or passages. Just the old boxes and forgotten furniture he had seen before. But just as he was about to turn and leave, something caught his eye. In the far corner of the attic, something gleamed faintly in the beam of his flashlight. It was a small object, partially hidden behind a stack of old crates. The father's heart raced as he approached it, unsure of what he would find. As he picked it up, he realized it was another photograph, this one even more disturbing than the last. The photo was taken from inside the house, just like the one in the crawl space. But this time, the photographer had focused on the family from a closer angle. They were sitting at the dinner table, unaware of the camera. The father's stomach churned as he looked at the photo. It was taken recently, he could tell from the clothes they were wearing. This was no prank. Whoever had been hiding in their home had been watching them every day, silently observing their every move. A wave of panic washed over him. He couldn't stay in the attic any longer. He stumbled down the stairs, his mind racing. The photograph felt like a personal violation, a reminder that their privacy had been completely invaded. It wasn't just the pictures, it was the realization that someone had been living in their house, using the attic, the crawl space, as a hideout. The father's thoughts raced, trying to make sense of it. Who had done this? Why had they done it? And most importantly, were they still here? The father's anxiety grew by the day. He no longer felt safe in his own home. Every corner of the house seemed to hold a secret, every shadow seemed to hide something more sinister. The thought of someone, or something, watching him and his family made it impossible to relax. He tried to keep a brave face for the sake of his children, but deep down, he was terrified. The house had become a prison, and there was no escape from it. Over the next few days, the father became obsessed with searching for answers. He visited the local library, poring over old newspaper clippings, hoping to find any mention of the house's previous owners. What he discovered shocked him. The elderly woman who had lived there had died under mysterious circumstances. She had been found in the attic, her body hidden for weeks before anyone discovered it. The cause of death was never determined, and the authorities had ruled it an accident. But the rumors that circulated afterward suggested something much darker. Some claimed she had been a recluse, while others whispered about strange happenings in the house. The more the father learned, the more it seemed that the house had always been a place of mystery and unease. No one knew much about the previous owners before the elderly woman, but there were rumors of people disappearing in the area over the years. Some believed the house was cursed, while others thought it was simply bad luck. But whatever the truth was, the father couldn't shake the feeling that he and his family were not the first to experience the house's dark secrets. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, they heard a loud bang coming from upstairs. The father's heart skipped a beat. He jumped to his feet, signaling to the children to stay where they were. His mind raced. Could it be another intruder? Was someone still in the house? He grabbed a bat from the closet and cautiously made his way upstairs, his every step careful and deliberate. The noise had come from the attic, and he was determined to find out what was going on. When he reached the attic door, he hesitated. The thought of going back into that dark space, the place where he had found the photographs, filled him with dread. But he had no choice. He had to face whatever was lurking in the shadows. With a deep breath, he opened the door and shone his flashlight inside. The attic was eerily quiet, but there was something different this time. The air felt heavier, colder. And as his flashlight beam swept across the room, he saw it. In the center of the attic, something was moving. It was small, almost indistinguishable in the darkness, but the movement was unmistakable. The father's blood ran cold as he stepped closer, the flashlight trembling in his hand. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was a figure, hunched over, moving in a slow, deliberate manner. The father's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to scream, to run, but his feet wouldn't move. He was frozen, caught in a grip of terror. The figure suddenly stopped moving, as if it had sensed the father's presence. The father's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure was humanoid, but distorted, like something that didn't belong in the real world. It was covered in tattered clothes, and its face was obscured by long, matted hair. The father couldn't see its eyes, but he could feel its gaze. It was as if it was staring directly into his soul. Without thinking, the father turned and fled from the attic, his feet pounding against the stairs. He didn't look back, but the image of the figure stayed with him, haunting his every step. He didn't know what he had seen or what it meant, but one thing was certain: there was something in that house. And it wasn't human. The days that followed were a blur of fear and confusion. The family stayed huddled together in the living room, refusing to sleep in their own beds. The father couldn't bring himself to tell his family what he had seen in the attic. He didn't know how to explain it. He couldn't even explain it to himself. All he knew was that whatever was in their home, it was far from over. The police were called once more, but this time, they found nothing. No signs of intrusion, no evidence of anyone living in the attic or crawl space. It was as if the house had swallowed all evidence of the creature that haunted it. The family was left with no answers, only the unsettling certainty that they were not alone. As the days turned into weeks, the family grew more and more isolated. The father couldn't shake the feeling that the house had taken something from them. It had taken their sense of safety, their peace of mind, and now it was slowly consuming them. The creeping dread that had first gripped him was now a constant presence in every room. The father began to question his own sanity. Was he imagining all of this? Or was something truly living in the house with them? The family eventually made the decision to leave the house. They couldn't live in fear any longer. But as they packed their things and prepared to leave, the father couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching them, waiting for them to leave. He looked one last time at the dark corners of the house, the shadows that seemed to shift on their own. He knew, without a doubt, that whatever had been in that house, it wasn't going to let them go so easily. After days of feeling the presence of something eerie in their home, the father knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. The family was on edge, and their once peaceful house had transformed into a place of dread. The atmosphere felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. He had to do something, but the question was, what? How could he protect his family from an unseen force that seemed to have made itself at home in their house? One evening, as the family sat quietly in the living room, the father made a decision. He had to confront whatever it was. He would go back to the attic. His mind was set. He couldn't live in constant fear. If he didn't face this head-on, he feared it would only get worse. He grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar, determined to uncover the truth. The attic was just as dark and ominous as he remembered. He took a deep breath and slowly ascended the stairs, his heart pounding with every step. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and his flashlight flickered as he scanned the space. It was as if the house itself was resisting him, pushing him back into the darkness. He forced himself to ignore the unease building in his chest and focused on the task at hand. As he stepped into the attic, the silence was deafening. The old furniture and boxes were exactly where they had been before, but there was something off about it now. The shadows seemed deeper, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. The father shivered, but he pressed on, determined to find answers. He started by looking through the boxes, hoping to uncover something that would explain the strange happenings. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. It was faint at first, like a soft scratching or tapping, coming from the farthest corner of the attic. The father froze, his pulse quickening. He listened closely, and the noise came again, louder this time. It was coming from behind a large stack of boxes. Without thinking, he moved toward it, the flashlight shaking in his hand. When he reached the stack, he hesitated. What if it was nothing? What if it was just the house settling? But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Something had been hiding here, something that was now stirring in the shadows. His heart raced as he moved the boxes aside, revealing a small trapdoor hidden beneath the floorboards. The sight of it sent a chill down his spine. He had never noticed the trapdoor before, and it hadn't been there when he first moved in. His mind raced with questions. Who had built it? Why had they hidden it? And most importantly, what lay beneath it. He knelt down and slowly lifted the trapdoor, feeling a sense of dread flood over him. The moment the door creaked open, a musty, foul odor rushed out. It was the smell of something long forgotten, something that had been sealed away for far too long. The father recoiled slightly, but his curiosity pushed him forward. He grabbed the flashlight and shone it down into the dark hole below. The beam of light revealed a narrow staircase, leading down into the blackness. He hesitated for a moment, but then the thought of the family, their safety, pushed him forward. He had to know what was down there. He grabbed a rope from the corner of the attic, tied it to a sturdy beam, and descended into the darkness. With each step, the air grew colder, and the oppressive feeling in his chest intensified. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a small, dimly lit room. It looked ancient, almost as if it had been untouched for decades. The walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper, and the floor was littered with dust and debris. The father's flashlight flickered as he moved deeper into the room, and he felt a sense of unease creep up his spine. It was as if something was watching him. His beam of light landed on something in the far corner of the room. It was a large wooden chest, covered in a thick layer of dust. The father felt a strange compulsion to approach it, but he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that chest had been waiting for him. He moved cautiously toward it, his hand shaking as he reached for the latch. When he opened the chest, his eyes widened in shock. Inside were several old, tattered books, their pages yellowed with age. But beneath them, something else caught his attention, a collection of photographs, similar to the ones he had found in the attic in the crawl space. His stomach churned as he looked at them, realizing that they were all taken from the same perspective, as if someone had been watching them from inside their house. The photographs were haunting, images of the family at different times, at the dinner table, in the living room, even asleep in their beds. The father's hands trembled as he sifted through them, each photo more disturbing than the last. It was as if someone had been documenting their every move. But who? And why? As he continued to dig through the chest, he uncovered something even more horrifying, a journal. The leather cover was cracked and worn, and the pages were filled with strange, cryptic writing. The father's heart pounded as he read the first few lines. "I have seen them. I have watched them. They cannot leave. They are mine." The words seemed to burn into his mind, and he felt a wave of nausea wash over him. Who had written this? Was it the previous owner of the house? Or was it someone else, someone who had been living in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike? The father's thoughts raced as he closed the journal and shoved it back into the chest. He couldn't stay down there any longer. The air was thick with dread, and the feeling of being watched had only intensified. He quickly climbed back up the stairs and slammed the trapdoor shut, as if locking away the horrors he had just uncovered. Back in the attic, he sat down, his heart still racing. He felt like he had just uncovered a terrible secret, one that had been hidden away for years. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew one thing for sure: something dark had taken root in that house, and it wasn't ready to let go. The father didn't know what to do with the photographs or the journal. He couldn't bring himself to tell his family about what he had found, not yet. He needed to process it first. But one thing was clear: the house was more than just haunted, it was a trap. And whatever force had been watching them, it was growing stronger. That night, as the family sat in the living room, the father made a vow. He would protect his family, no matter what it took. He had uncovered the truth, but now he had to figure out how to stop it. He couldn't let the house claim them like it had claimed so many others before. The battle for their lives was just beginning. The next few days felt like an endless cycle of unease. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift of air in the house made the father's heart race. His mind could not escape the chilling images of the photographs and the journal. The house had become a prison. No matter where he went, he could feel the walls closing in. The weight of the secrets buried beneath it all pressed down on him, suffocating him in a way that words couldn't fully describe. His mind kept returning to the journal. Those cryptic words, I have seen them. I have watched them. They cannot leave. They are mine. They repeated in his thoughts like a mantra, an incantation that seemed to haunt him with every breath. What did it mean? Who had written it, and what was their connection to the house? More importantly, how was this entity watching them? The questions gnawed at him, each one deeper than the last, pulling him further into a dark spiral. But the father couldn't stop himself from returning to the chest. It was like a magnetic pull, something that beckoned him in a way he couldn't resist. He opened it again, heart pounding, hands shaking as he reached for the journal. He flipped through the yellowed pages, reading the cryptic messages over and over. Something in him felt like it was unraveling, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. One entry in the journal caught his attention. They are not alone. There are more. The house is never empty. The words were scrawled frantically, as if the writer had been in a rush, or worse, running out of time. The father's pulse quickened. More? What did that mean? Were there others? Was this entity, whatever it was, truly watching them, or was it something much more ancient? The father couldn't make sense of it, but he felt a growing urgency. The family's mood had shifted too. His wife, once optimistic, had become distant, her eyes often hollow as if she too could sense the same unseen presence that had consumed him. The children were no better. They had become withdrawn, speaking less and less. At night, they huddled together, eyes darting to the corners of the room as if something was lurking in the shadows. They had seen it too, their innocence now marred by something they couldn't fully comprehend. The father knew that something had to be done. He couldn't let his family continue to suffer in silence. But each night, when he tried to confront the darkness, it eluded him. The house seemed to have a life of its own. It shifted, it changed, and it always managed to stay one step ahead. Desperation drove him to research the house's history once more. He scoured old newspapers and local archives, hoping for a clue that could unlock the mystery. That's when he found it, buried deep in a forgotten article from decades ago. The story spoke of a family who had lived in the house long before him. They had disappeared without a trace. The police had investigated, but nothing was ever found. The case had been marked as unsolved. No one had ever spoken of it again. But there was more. According to the article, strange things had begun happening long before the family vanished. Neighbors spoke of hearing whispers in the night, seeing shadowy figures in the windows, and feeling an oppressive presence that seemed to hang over the property. The story ended abruptly, with no real conclusion, leaving more questions than answers. But one thing was clear, the house had a long, dark history, and whatever had been living there was not willing to let go. As he read, the father felt a sinking feeling in his chest. The disappearance of the family wasn't just some random event, it was a part of the house's twisted cycle. And now, it seemed, it was his family's turn to be claimed by the darkness. He couldn't allow it. But what could he do? What was the source of this malevolent force? One evening, after weeks of sleepless nights, the father made a decision. He would confront whatever was in the house, once and for all. Armed with the journal, a flashlight, and a rope, he descended into the crawl space again, determined to find the heart of the evil that had taken root in their home. This time, there would be no turning back. The crawl space was as oppressive as ever. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and dust, and the temperature seemed to drop the moment he stepped inside. His flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist. He moved cautiously, each step filled with uncertainty. His heart pounded in his chest, and every instinct told him to turn back, but he pressed on. As he neared the far corner of the crawl space, he felt it, an overwhelming sense of presence, like something was watching him. He turned the beam of his flashlight toward the wall and saw something that made his blood run cold. There, embedded in the wood, were markings, symbols carved deep into the surface, as if etched by something ancient and powerful. The symbols were unfamiliar, their meaning lost in time, but the father could feel their malevolent energy radiating from them. The father reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the symbols. A sudden jolt of energy shot through him, and he staggered back, gasping for air. The house seemed to groan around him, as if it were waking from a long slumber. The walls trembled, and the ground beneath him shook. He could hear a faint whisper, a voice too soft to understand, but filled with an unmistakable sense of malice. With shaking hands, he opened the journal and began to read aloud, hoping that somehow the words might break the spell that held the house in its grip. The more he read, the stronger the presence became, until it felt as though the very walls were closing in on him. He could feel it, a force stronger than anything he had ever encountered, a force that had been waiting for him to come to this very moment. The temperature plummeted as the room grew darker, and suddenly, a figure appeared before him. It was a shadow, a silhouette with glowing eyes that pierced the darkness. The father froze in place, unable to move, unable to speak. The figure stepped forward, its presence overwhelming, and the father's body trembled as the weight of its gaze bore down on him. Then, in a voice that echoed through the very walls of the house, the figure spoke. "You should never have come here," it hissed, its voice cold and sharp like ice. The father's heart raced, but he stood his ground. "I won't leave," he said, his voice shaking. "Not until I end this." The figure let out a low, eerie laugh. "You cannot end what was never meant to end." The father's mind raced as the figure advanced on him. But before it could reach him, there was a loud crash from above. The ceiling of the crawl space shattered, and the father was thrown to the ground. When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the crawl space. He was standing outside the house, the eerie silhouette of the building looming in front of him. The dark force that had consumed the house was now gone. For a brief moment, there was silence. But then, in the distance, he heard it, a soft whisper carried on the wind. "We are not done." The father's blood ran cold as the whisper echoed in his mind. It was a warning, a sign that the battle was far from over. The house may have been quiet for now, but something told him that the darkness would return, and next time, it would be even stronger. As the father turned away from the house, a single thought crossed his mind: they are still out there, waiting. And that was the moment he realized the nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun.